Most people think we stopped going to the moon because it wasn't worth the cost, or that the public lost interest after the first few Apollo missions. They're wrong. I know the truth, and it's something that's been buried under decades of lies, redacted files, and whispers in dark corridors. I've kept my silence for years, but last night, I received a transmission that changed everything. I have no choice but to reveal what really happened up there, and why we never went back. I was half asleep in my old cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, nursing a glass of bourbon by the fireplace, when the radio crackled to life. I had set it up years ago, a hobby more than anything else. The equipment was ancient, collecting dust, its knobs rusted and its wires tangled like an old man's thoughts. But suddenly, through the static, I heard it, an unmistakable voice from the past, faint but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "This is Apollo 18, come in, repeat, this is Apollo 18. I bolted upright, nearly knocking the bottle off the table. Apollo 18. The mission that officially never happened. A mission that wasn't supposed to exist, let alone transmit anything after all these years. My hands shook as I adjusted the frequency, hoping, praying, that I hadn't gone crazy or that my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. But the voice came again, more desperate, more garbled. "Harris, do you copy? This is Miller, we need." Frank Miller. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. My best friend, my brother in all but blood, and the man who never came back from the mission we never spoke about. The one buried deep in a place that didn't have a grave marker. They told me he died in a training accident in the Nevada desert. I knew better. I was there when they sent him up. I was there when they shut down the mission and told us all to forget it ever happened. But I never forgot. For nearly 50 years, I've lived with the ghost of Frank Miller haunting every corner of my mind. The classified files, the whispered threats, the late-night phone calls that were never answered, it all started flooding back. And now, this voice, his voice, reaching out from the void, sounding as if it came from the bottom of the sea rather than the cold expanse of space. I tried to respond, my fingers fumbling over the radio's dials, but no matter how much I tuned it, all I could get was more static, interspersed with bursts of that familiar but eerie crackling. I could almost hear something in the background, like a faint, mechanical hum, or maybe a heartbeat. It didn't make any damn sense. Apollo 18 was cancelled in 1970, officially. The public was told we were done with moon missions after Apollo 17. But there was one more. I was a communications engineer back then, one of the few cleared for special projects. We were told Apollo 18 was a routine reconnaissance mission, just another flag-planting exercise to justify the budget. But when Frank got selected, he called me the night before they launched. I remember every word he said like it was yesterday. "They aren't telling us everything, John. There's something out there. Something they don't want us to see. If I don't make it back, promise me you'll find out why." And then he was gone. They classified everything. They said he died on the pad, a fuel leak, a tragic accident. They shut down the base, reassigned all of us to different projects, and pretended it never happened. I tried to dig, but every door was slammed shut in my face. I tried asking around, but the more questions I asked, the more I realized that people were either too afraid or too well paid to say anything. Eventually, I gave up. I buried myself in work, retired early, and moved out here to the mountains to drink away the nightmares. Until tonight. Until Frank's voice pulled me back from the grave of my own making. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, like someone was watching me from the shadows of my own cabin. I glanced around, half expecting to see a man in a black suit with a thin smile, but there was nothing. Just the faint rustle of the wind outside and the persistent crackle of the radio. I leaned in closer to the receiver, my heart pounding. "Frank, is that you? Where are you?" The response was immediate, but not what I expected. There was a low, distorted growl, like metal scraping on metal, and then, laughter. Deep, guttural, like the laughter of someone who knows a secret that you don't. My blood ran cold. I knew that sound. I had heard it once before, years ago, on a different frequency. Back when I still worked for NASA, back when we still had missions going up there. "This is Apollo 18, come in. God help us, they're here." And then silence. The kind of silence that has a weight to it, as if the air itself were pressing down on me, heavy and thick. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could hear my own breath, ragged and shaky. I knew I had to get to my files, to the hidden stash I'd kept in a metal box under the floorboards, documents I wasn't supposed to have, things I copied when I knew the end was near. I scrambled to the floor, prying up the loose board with my bare hands, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I pulled out the box, my fingers trembling, and opened it to reveal the files, yellowed, water-stained, but intact. I flipped through them, desperate to find something, anything, that might explain what I had just heard. There, at the bottom, was a photograph. Black and white, grainy. It showed Frank, in his suit, on a surface that looked like the moon. But beside him, there was something else. A figure. Not human. Decayed, skeletal, but with a shape that suggested familiarity. And in the background, just beyond the lunar module, a shadow that shouldn't be there. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I knew then that whatever happened to Frank and his crew wasn't just an accident. And I knew why we never went back to the moon. Because something is still up there, waiting. Back in 1976, the desert heat was relentless, even at night. The hidden facility was buried deep in the Nevada sands, far from prying eyes. We called it the bunker, but it was more than that. An underground labyrinth of control rooms, labs, and communication centers, built for one purpose: Apollo 18. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, it was the last place on Earth anyone wanted to be. I was there because they needed someone they could trust, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. But trust only goes so far. The day I walked into that control room, I knew this mission was different. For one, they'd brought in a scientist I'd never heard of, Dr. Evelyn Green. Tall, sharp-eyed, always clutching a notebook like it held the secrets of the universe. She was brilliant, they said, but secretive too. She'd been briefed separately, kept apart from the rest of us. Then there was Colonel Richard Hayes, the mission commander. A man of few words, the kind of guy who could stare a hole through you without saying a thing. Everyone respected him, but nobody really knew him. He had the look of someone who'd seen too much, who carried too many secrets. He didn't trust me, and I sure as hell didn't trust him. And then there was Frank Miller, my old friend, the one guy I could count on. Always had a grin on his face, even when the stakes were high. He'd been to the moon before, knew the risks, but he wasn't afraid. "Another day, another dollar," he'd joke, but I could see the tension in his eyes. He knew something was off about this mission, just like I did. We were told the mission was simple: check out some strange signals picked up by a satellite near the dark side of the moon, maybe retrieve some samples. But from the moment I walked in, I knew they were keeping us in the dark. The files were redacted, the briefings short, the questions met with cold stares or vague answers. "Need to know, Harris," Hayes would say, every time I pressed for details. But it wasn't just the secrecy that set me on edge. It was the way Green and Hayes spoke in hushed tones, always glancing over their shoulders, like they expected someone, or something, to be listening. I tried to talk to Frank about it, but he just shrugged it off. "They're spooked," he said. "But we're used to that, right?" The launch was smoother than expected, no hiccups, no delays. They disappeared into the black, the calms clear as day until they reached lunar orbit. That's when things started going wrong. At first, it was just small things, fluctuations in the signal, minor malfunctions. But then the transmissions started coming in. Strange sounds, faint and garbled, like whispers in a language I'd never heard before. "Harris, you hearing this?" Frank's voice crackled through my headset. I adjusted the dials, trying to clear the interference, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent, like a broken record stuck on some foreign chant. "Must be solar interference," Hayes said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Green's face was pale, her hands clutching that damn notebook tighter than ever. I glanced at her notes over her shoulder once, just for a second, and saw something that sent a chill down my spine, a drawing, crude but unmistakable. A shape, a figure, something that didn't look human. The next day, Frank's voice came through again, more urgent this time. "Harris, we're seeing something, movement. It's in the shadows on the surface. Can you confirm?" I scanned the satellite feeds, my heart racing. Sure enough, there it was, a shadow, faint but moving, darting across the lunar surface where nothing should be moving at all. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Nothing here," I lied, but Frank wasn't buying it. "Bullshit, John. We see it. It's there." Hayes cut in, his voice stern. "Stay focused, Miller. Stay on task. Proceed to the coordinates." But the tension was building. Equipment started malfunctioning, simple things, like the oxygen meters flickering or the navigation systems freezing up. Frank's voice grew tighter, more strained. "Harris, I swear to God, there's something out here. It's watching us." Hayes cut the transmission. Green was scribbling furiously in her notebook, eyes wide, muttering something under her breath that I couldn't make out. I leaned closer. "What is it? What aren't you telling us?" She looked up, her face a mask of fear, and whispered, "We're not alone." I could hear the tremor in her voice, the kind of fear that only comes from knowing something terrible, something she couldn't unsee or unhear. Hayes slammed his hand on the table. "That's enough, Green. We're here to retrieve, not theorize." Frank's voice cut through the tension again, this time lower, almost a whisper. "Harris, there's a structure here. It's not natural. And there's something inside. I think it's waiting for us." The comms went dead. Total silence. I tried every channel, every frequency, but there was nothing. Just static. For a few agonizing moments, I thought I'd lost him. Then, just as suddenly, Frank's voice came back, panicked. It's alive! It's moving! Get us out of here!" Green started to cry, quiet sobs that seemed to echo through the entire room. Hayes was shouting orders, his face a mix of anger and fear I hadn't seen before. I felt my hands start to shake, my own breath quickening. "Harris! John, if you can hear me!" Frank's voice was cracking, filled with a terror I'd never heard from him before. "They lied to us, they knew something was here." I looked over at Green, whose face was pale as death. Her notebook was open to a page filled with symbols, strange symbols that seemed to twist and writhe on the paper like they were alive. Hayes was on the radio, trying to calm Frank down, trying to bring the situation under control, but I knew things were far from under control. There were shadows moving on the screens, darker than the lunar night, moving in patterns that didn't make sense. I felt the cold creeping in, not from the room, but from deep inside, a feeling I couldn't shake. And then, just before the transmission cut off completely, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable, the sound of that laughter, deep, mechanical, almost inhuman. And I knew something was very, very wrong. "Harris! God help us, it's too late!" And then, nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that buries secrets deeper than the darkest moon craters. Frank's voice was ragged with tension as he described the structure. It's massive, John. Bigger than anything we expected. Half buried, like it's been here for centuries, or longer." He sounded like he was struggling to breathe. His words clipped and hurried, as if he could feel something pressing against his chest. "It's not made of stone, it looks almost organic." The surface cameras relayed back grainy images, a structure jutting out from the moon's surface, its edges smooth, too smooth, curving in ways that defied the eye, like it was meant to be hidden. It didn't belong there, not on the lunar landscape. Its surface gleamed faintly in the sunlight, as if it were made of a material that absorbed light, drank it in. It looked ancient, and yet, alive. Hayes' voice cut in, harsh and commanding. "Focus, Miller. This isn't a sightseeing tour." Green confirmed the readings. Dr. Green's hands were trembling, her voice barely a whisper as she replied. "It matches the signatures, the ones we picked up in 1969. She hesitated, then added, This structure is emitting signals, the same signals. Frank's breathing was audible, labored. You're telling me we're not the first to find this place? Green didn't answer. She seemed lost in her own thoughts, her eyes fixated on the alien structure, a look of recognition, or maybe fear, flickering across her face. Hayes, ignoring the question, barked out orders. Miller, approach the entrance. Green, take samples. We need to secure whatever's inside before extraction. Frank moved forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the lunar dust. I don't like this, John, he muttered, half to himself, half to me. I don't like this at all. But he kept moving, edging closer to the dark mouth of the structure, a yawning hole that seemed to swallow the light around it. Inside, the darkness was almost absolute, broken only by the beams of their helmet lights. Dust motes hung in the air like tiny stars, disturbed by the movement of the team. And there, in the center of the chamber, they found it. A figure. It lay crumpled on the ground, half buried in the dust, its limbs twisted at odd angles. At first, it looked almost human. But as Frank got closer, the details came into view. Its skin, or what was left of it, was thin, almost translucent, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its head was elongated, the eyes sunken deep into hollow sockets, its mouth slightly open, as if frozen in a silent scream. Green gasped, dropping her notebook. My God, it's... Her voice trailed off. I could hear her rapid breathing over the comms, a slight tremor in her voice. Frank turned back, his voice hard. What the hell is this, Green? You know something. You recognize this thing, don't you? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes locked onto the figure, a mixture of fear and something else, something I couldn't quite place. We've seen traces of this form. In the samples, from Apollo 11. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. They knew something was here. Hayes didn't hesitate. Bag it. We're taking it back with us. Frank spun around, his voice angry now. Are you out of your mind? We don't even know what it is, what it's capable of. Hayes cut him off sharply. That's an order, Miller. We're here to retrieve, not to question. Green moved toward the figure, producing a containment bag, her hands shaking. We don't have much time. She murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Frank stood his ground, his voice a low growl. I don't like this, Colonel. This thing, it doesn't belong here. We should leave it. Hayes stepped forward, his tone brooking no argument. You're here to follow orders, Miller. Not debate them. Green hesitated, then reached down, her fingers brushing against the creature's skin. The moment she touched it, the ground seemed to shudder, a low rumble vibrating through the structure. What the hell was that? Frank's voice was tight with panic. Get it bagged and let's move. Hayes snapped. Green hurried, wrapping the figure in the containment bag, sealing it tight. We've got it, she confirmed, but her voice was hollow, as if she didn't quite believe her own words. Then, everything went dark. The lights flickered, and for a brief, terrifying moment, all I could hear was the sound of their breathing, quick and shallow. And then, a voice. Not Frank's, not Green's, not Hayes'. A cold, mechanical voice, flat and emotionless, filled with a strange resonance that seemed to echo from deep within the moon itself. You should not be here. The comms crackled with static, and I heard Frank swear under his breath. What was that? Hayes was shouting now, trying to get control. Miller, report. Green, what the hell is going on? The shadows around them began to shift, moving like liquid in the dim light, creeping closer. Frank's voice was frantic. It's moving! The shadows, they're moving! The module systems began to fail, one by one. I watched in horror as the telemetry screens flashed warnings, red lights blinking everywhere. Oxygen levels dropping. Power surges. Communications breaking up. Green's voice came through, barely audible over the chaos. We need to leave, now! But it was too late. The shadows were upon them, closing in, shapes moving in ways that defied logic, defied physics. Hayes' voice was a bark of desperation. "Get to the module, now!" Frank was panting, his voice filled with fear. They're right behind us." The shadows reached out, tendrils of darkness stretching across the surface, creeping up the module's landing struts. The voice came again, colder this time, as if coming from the deepest part of space itself. "You are not welcome." The module's engines roared to life, sputtering, struggling. "We're losing power," Green shouted, her voice high with panic. "We're not gonna make it." The shadows grew thicker, darker, swallowing the light. The structure seemed to pulse, alive with some unseen energy. Frank's last words cut through the static, a scream filled with both terror and defiance. "Get us out of here, John, they're coming." And then, all at once, the feed went dead. The monitors blinked off, the screens went dark. I was left alone in the silence of the control room, the only sound my own ragged breath. The only thing left was that last, chilling transmission, echoing in my mind. "You should not have come." They brought them back in the dead of night. No fanfare, no press, no parade. Just a cold, clinical arrival under the cover of darkness. The surviving astronauts, if you could even call them that, looked like shadows of their former selves. Frank was hunched over, eyes darting around, his skin pale and waxy, as if he'd aged a decade in the few days since I'd last heard his voice. Dr. Green was different, too. Not scared exactly, but hollow. Her eyes were wide and empty, her movements stiff, almost robotic, like she was stuck in a loop, replaying the same nightmare over and over. They kept them apart from the start. Green was whisked away by a group of men in black suits, their faces hard and unreadable, their movements precise, almost military. I'd never seen them before, and they didn't wear any insignias, but there was something about the way they looked at me, cold, clinical, like they were measuring me up for a coffin. They moved Green through the hangar and into a black van that had no plates, and I never saw her again. Frank, on the other hand, was kept in a holding room at the edge of the facility, a small, windowless cell with one-way glass. They said it was for debriefing, but I knew better. I managed to slip in under the guise of maintenance, just to see him. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands were trembling, and his voice was a cracked whisper. "John, they're watching, they're always watching." "What happened up there, Frank?" I asked, keeping my voice low, glancing over my shoulder. "What did you see?" He just shook his head, his eyes wide, pupils dilated like a trapped animal. "We weren't alone, John. There's something out there, something they don't want us to know about." He leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "They knew, John. They knew something was up there, waiting. And now they're trying to bury it all, and us with it." Before he could say more, the door burst open, and two men grabbed Frank by the shoulders, dragging him away. "That's enough, Miller," one of them snapped. "You've said too much." Frank struggled, shouting over his shoulder. "John! Find Green! Find out what she knew!" Then they were gone, and I was left standing there, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I knew I was in deep now. Too deep. The next day, I was called into a briefing. They handed me a thick file, sealed with a red top secret stamp. Inside were photos, blurry, dark, but unmistakable. Images of the alien figure they'd found on the moon. And then I saw Green's handwriting scrawled across the bottom of one of the photos. They knew. It's not over. I didn't have time to process it before the threats started. A phone call in the middle of the night. No voice on the other end, just breathing. The feeling of being watched, always watched. A note slipped under my door, written in neat, mechanical handwriting. "Stay silent or else." But I couldn't let it go. I started digging, quietly, carefully. The more I dug, the more I found. Small pieces that didn't fit together, disappearances, strange sightings, whispers of things moving in the dark where nothing should move. I kept my head down at work, acted like I'd let it go, but I never stopped searching. Then one night, a man showed up at my door. Tall, thin, with a nervous twitch in his eye. He claimed he was a journalist, but his clothes were too clean, his shoes too shiny. He introduced himself as Paul Harper, said he'd been following the Apollo 18 story for years. "You don't know the half of it," he said, his voice a mix of fear and excitement. "This goes deeper than you think. Way deeper. The mission was just the tip of the iceberg." He showed me a folder full of documents, grainy photos of unidentified flying objects, maps with red circles drawn around places that made no sense. "These are just a few of the incidents," he explained. "UFO sightings, strange disappearances of astronauts, pilots, even civilians. All connected to the same pattern, the same signals, the same cover-ups." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How do you know all this?" He looked around, his eyes darting nervously. "Because I've been tracking them. I've been following the people they silenced, the stories they tried to erase. And I found something big. There are others, John. Others who didn't make it back, and others who saw what they weren't supposed to see." I didn't want to believe him, but I had to admit, there was a ring of truth to his words. Everything I'd seen, everything I'd heard, it all started to fit together in a way I didn't like. He handed me a tape recorder. This is a recording from a pilot who saw something on the moon, before Apollo 18. He disappeared a week after he made this. Just listen." I pressed play, and the voice crackled through the static, full of fear. There's something up here. It's not human. It's watching us. We never should have come." The tape cut off abruptly. I felt my skin crawl. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because they're watching you now, John," Harper replied. "And they'll do whatever it takes to keep you quiet. They've done it before, and they'll do it again. You need to be careful. Very careful." He left as quickly as he'd arrived, and I was left standing there with the tape recorder in my hand, feeling like the walls were closing in. From that point on, nothing felt safe. Every shadow seemed too dark, every sound too loud. My phone rang at odd hours, and when I answered, there was only silence. My mail was opened and resealed. I caught glimpses of men in dark cars parked outside my house, their faces hidden behind tinted windows. I started seeing things, flashes of light in the sky at night, shadows moving where no shadows should be. My heart raced every time I left the house, every time I turned a corner. I knew I was being followed, but I couldn't prove it. I tried to reach out to others, old contacts, but one by one they stopped answering. I was being cut off, isolated. And then, one night, my brakes failed. I barely managed to swerve off the road before the car slammed into a tree. I crawled out, dazed, my head throbbing, and I knew they were getting closer. I could feel it in my bones, in my blood. They weren't going to let me go. Not now. Not ever. They had secrets to keep, secrets buried deep. And they were willing to bury anyone who got too close. I knew I was next. But I also knew I had to keep digging. Because whatever they were hiding, it was bigger than I could have ever imagined. I knew my days were numbered the moment I decided to go public. But the truth has a way of gnawing at you, burrowing deep until it's all you can think about. I couldn't live with the lies anymore, the half-truths whispered in the corridors of power. People deserved to know what really happened up there, why we never went back. I set up a live stream, connected through a series of proxy servers to keep them from tracing me too quickly. The screen flickered to life, the camera pointed at me, an old man with tired eyes and secrets weighing heavy on his shoulders. I leaned forward, my voice steady, clear. "You've all been lied to," I began. "For over 50 years, you've been told the same story. We stopped going to the moon because we lost interest, because there was nothing left to find. That's not true. We never went back because we found something up there, something we were never meant to find." I took a deep breath, knowing that every word I said was being monitored. During Apollo 11, we disturbed something. An ancient civilization dormant, buried beneath the moon's surface. They didn't tell the public, they didn't tell the world. But they knew. They knew from the moment Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar dust. I paused, watching the view count climb on my screen. Thousands were tuning in, their curiosity piqued, their minds racing. They heard it first. I continued. A signal, a sound, something reaching out from the dark side of the moon. A transmission that wasn't human. They covered it up, said it was just interference, but it wasn't. And that's why Apollo 18 was launched. I leaned in closer, my face filling the screen. Apollo 18 was sent to investigate, to retrieve something. But they didn't tell the crew what they were walking into. They didn't tell them that they were about to wake something up. I described the alien structure, the strange signals, the shadows that moved on their own. I described Frank's terror, his final words, the way he pleaded for help as the darkness closed in around them. Frank and his crew were attacked by something we still don't understand, something that was waiting for us. Something that wanted to stay hidden. The screen showed images I'd saved from the classified files. The alien figure, the symbols in Green's handwriting, the strange shapes captured on the surface of the moon. They'd been watching us ever since. Watching and waiting. And we're not prepared for what's coming next. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I could feel the pressure mounting, the sense that I was running out of time. I looked straight into the camera, my voice steady. You need to understand, we are not alone. We never were. And now they know we know. They're not just out there, they're here, among us, and they've been watching. And then, as if on cue, I heard it, a soft rustle outside my window, a shadow moving just beyond the glass. My heart pounded, my breath catching in my throat. I forced myself to keep speaking. They will come for me, just like they came for the others. But you need to know, you need to be ready. Suddenly, the lights flickered, the screen glitched. The feed crackled with static, the image breaking up. I saw movement behind me, a shadow crossing the room, and then I knew they'd found me. I didn't stop. I kept talking, my voice rising over the interference. They're here. They've always been here. And now, they're making their move. Stay vigilant. Stay awake. Don't trust the story you've been told. The screen went black. The static filled the air, sharp and loud, and then, silence. For a moment, it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. And then, just as suddenly, the transmission cut back in. A voice crackled through, a deep, distorted voice, one that wasn't mine. We are not alone. We never were. The sound echoed, low and menacing, repeating like a mantra. And then, on the screen, a shadow crossed the moon's surface, larger than anything that should be there, moving against the stark, pale light. The feed flickered once, twice, and then, it cut out. Darkness. Silence. The kind that stretches on forever. The screen remained black, but the words hung in the air, a final, chilling reminder. We are not alone. We never were. Somewhere, in the cold vacuum of space, something had been awakened. And down here on Earth, we were just beginning to understand the gravity of what we had disturbed. The truth was out now, but it was too late to stop what was coming. Too late to hide from the eyes that had been watching us all along. And the question, the one that no one wanted to ask, hung in the air. What happens next? Hello, agents. Like these stories? Make sure to subscribe, and there's another story waiting for you right here.